Okay, let's go.
Okay, good morning, everyone. 16th of May, we started this reading seminar in March, so nearly 2 months ago. As people join us, we're going to give everybody a little bit of time to join us this morning. It might not be the morning for some of you, or it might be very early morning for others. So just to say welcome, everyone. We are saying hello to participants from all corners of the world, from Paris, from New York, from India, from Turkey, from Greece, from Brazil, very early in Brazil, from Ghent, Belgium, from Spain. Don't be shy, let us know where are you joining us from. We are absolutely delighted to begin the 7th meeting of Oceanic. We have participants from London, from Sri Lanka, from Cyprus, from Australia, from Palestine, from Toronto, Canada, from Melbourne, from Mexico, from Kolkata in India, from Austria. This is absolutely wonderful. 7 meetings already. This is the second last. We are absolutely delighted to welcome once again Veronique Voruz to be our commentator of the
having me again.
of chapter 7, and also to have Sheila Power doing the reading of this chapter 7. Before we begin, I would like to take a few minutes, if that's okay with everyone, and from Israel as well. I see now we have colleagues joining us from there. I would like to take a few minutes to make some announcements and share some information with you. For those of us who are joining us for the first time, this seminar has been organized by ICLO-NLS. ICLO Society of the NLS is the Irish Circle of the Lacanian Orientation. I would like to thank especially the Bureau, Joanne, Conway, Linda Clarke, Susan McFeely for supporting this initiative. I would also like to thank very much Cecilia Sabiotti and Linda Clarke for their invaluable help and assistance with the technical side of things and registration. We have at the moment 120 participants, and most of you have been attending every week. We had a little pause last week and we will have another one next week. And that's because there were some events already scheduled in our calendar, in our annual program of formation. So I take the opportunity to invite you all to join us next weekend. We have 2 events, one on the Friday evening at 7 p.m. Dublin time on supervision in the Lacanian orientation, more broadly supervision in psychoanalysis. What does it mean? and how does it how does supervision constitute one of the pillars of the so-called training of analysts. But this is not only for Lacanian analysts, it's of interest to anybody who is engaged in any kind of clinical practice, also in institutions and in other settings. This seminar is going to be delivered by Gustavo de Sal, who is a psychoanalyst in Madrid, and who is also going to give a seminar on Saturday at 11 a.m. Dublin time on technologies and psychoanalysts. Yeah, not technologies and psychoanalysis, but technologies and psychoanalysts. So that should be of interest to many of you, and we hope to see you there. The second announcement I wanted to make is that you may have seen it already in your email box if you're subscribed to LRO, to the Lacanian Review Online. The new issue of the Lacanian Review, which is the journal of the NLS and the English-speaking journal of the World Association of Psychoanalysis, has published today its 9th issue. It's called Still Life with a question mark. I must say that the question mark wasn't there when we began planning this issue. It's something that came to be added since we find ourselves in the current pandemic. So I invite you to explore the table of contents and the presentation that its editors, I should say, Marie-Ellen Bruce and Cyrus Polyanov have written. The third announcement that I would like to make, and I'm very happy, we announced this in our last meeting 2 weeks ago, that the most recent issue of ICLO's publication, Scrib, was going to be out. So it has been published last week. The 7th issue of Scrib, which in Gaelic, in Irish language, means writing, is edited by Raphael Montague, who is, I believe, with us today this morning. I'm going to invite him to say a few words about this new issue and why, if you haven't done so yet, you should go and read it. It's a free journal that is published periodically online, but it's not just a publication. Raphael Montague, who is a member of ICLO-NLS and who is also a columnist of the Lacanian Review Online, produces an object that is I would say elevated to the status of an art object. He does the design and he produces the art included in this publication. Raphael is also a beautiful writer, so that also brings something to the journal as well in his editorials. So I would like to invite him to say something about this new issue.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Fine praise indeed. Thanks. I had to put on some clothes in case there was a camera because this was unexpected. So let me say something about Scriab. Yes, in the Irish language, in Gaelic, it means writing. Let me see. Morning. Hi. It means writing. As with as with many signifiers in the Irish language, because it's such an old language, it's one of the great languages of the ancient world, along with Sanskrit and Hebrew. Because it's such an ancient language, signifiers tend to have multiple meanings. There's probably 50 different, it's a joke, but there's probably 50 different words in the Irish language for rain. And as with that, scríomh also means, for example, my favorite is the scratchings of a hen. And I would liken this, I would liken what I do to the scratchings of a hen, basically. I'm not sure that I'd consider it art. Now, this was the central theme around the letter in Joyce's work. The letter turned up via the scratchings of a hen in a rubbish heap. You could say Lacan's publication. Joyce had it first. Well, had it first. That the letter ends up in the rubbish heap. Now, having that said, this issue of scríomh is excellent. We publish a great paper by an Argentinian analyst, Leonardo Gorostiza, and it poses a question which is central to each one that is involved in psychoanalytic practice, in the Lacanian orientation. It poses the question, and it was a question that I hadn't thought about in this way before. It poses a question, what is the Lacanian orientation? And it takes one of Lacan's interventions, which kind of serves as a maxim, but it doesn't. What is the analytic act in terms of clarifying the abruptness of the real? And to put that in this way is the first time I think this has been put in that way in the English language. So I'm very pleased personally about that. And I hope that you'll all subscribe. You'll find the link on the ICLO website, ICLO-NLS.org, and you can also see the previous 6 digital issues, and we also managed to do 2 print issues. The first is called Transference in and Out, and the second is called From the One Through Another, and it's a clarification for the first time in the English language proper of autism and plural practice, a psychoanalytic clinical approach with respect to autism. So that's what I have to say, other than there is an editorial team, an editorial board, which comprises at the moment of Caroline Heanue, Joanne Conway, Sheila Power, myself, Lorna Kernan, and Florencia was guest editor for this particular issue 7, what is the Lacanian orientation. So thank you for that. I wish you well with your reading and commentary. I'll be tuned in. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Raphael. I will now introduce the reader for today for chapter 7. Sheila Power is a member of ICLO-NLS. She practices psychoanalysis in Dublin. She has extensive experience after working for many years in one of the most important maternity hospitals in Dublin as well. And as Raphael said, she's part of the editorial board of Scrib, and she's going to read chapter 7 for us, Civilization and Its Discontents.
Great. You can hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks, Florencia, for inviting me to read this chapter, and also thanks to the ICLO board and to Linda and Cecilia behind the scenes as well. So, chapter 7. What do our relatives, the animals, not exhibit any such cultural struggles? Sorry, I'm going to start again. Why do our relatives, the animals, not exhibit any such cultural struggle? We do not know. Very probably some of them, the bees, the ants, the termites, strove for thousands of years before they arrived at the state institutions, the distribution of functions, and the restrictions on the individual, for which we admire them today. It is a mark of our present condition that we know from our own feelings that we should not think ourselves happy in any of these animal states, or in any of the roles assigned in them to the individual. In the case of other animal species, it may be that a temporary balance has been reached between the influence of their environment and the mutually contending instincts within them, and that thus a cessation of development has come about. It may be that in primitive man, a fresh access of libido kindled a renewed burst of activity on the part of the destructive instinct. There are a great many questions here to which as yet there is no answer. Another question concerns us more nearly. What means does civilization employ in order to inhibit the aggressiveness which opposes it, to make it harmless, to get rid of it perhaps? We've already become acquainted with a few of these methods, but not yet with the one that appears to be the most important. This we can study in the history of the development of the individual. What happens in him to render his desire for aggression innocuous? Something very remarkable, which we should never have guessed, and which is nevertheless quite obvious. His aggressiveness is introjected, internalized. It is, in point of fact, sent back to where it came from. That is, it is directed towards his own ego. There, it is taken over by a portion of the ego, which sets itself over against the rest of the ego as superego, and which now, in the form of conscience, is ready to put into action against the ego the same harsh aggressiveness that the ego would have liked to satisfy upon other extraneous individuals. The tension between the harsh superego and the ego that is subjected to it is called by us the sense of guilt. It expresses itself as a need for punishment. Civilization, therefore, obtains mastery over the individual's dangerous desire for aggression by weakening and disarming it, and by setting up an agency within him to watch over it, like a garrison in a conquered city. As to the origin of the sense of guilt, the analyst has different views from other psychologists, but even he does not find it easy to give an account of it. To begin with, if we ask how a person comes to have a sense of guilt, we arrive at an answer which cannot be disputed. A person feels guilty, devout people would say sinful, when he has done something which he knows to be bad. But then we notice how little this answer tells us. Perhaps, after some hesitation, we shall add that even when a person has not actually done the bad thing, but has only recognized in himself an intention to do it, he may regard himself as guilty. And the question then arises of why the intention is regarded as equal to the deed. Both cases, however, presuppose that one had already recognized that what is bad is reprehensible, is something that must not be carried out. How is this judgment arrived at? We may reject the existence of an original, as it were, natural capacity to distinguish good from bad. What is bad is often not at all what is injurious or dangerous to the ego. On the contrary, it may be something which is desirable and enjoyable to the ego. Here, therefore, There is an extraneous influence at work, and it is this that decides what is to be called good or bad. Since a person's own feelings would not have led him along this path, he must have had a motive for submitting to this extraneous influence. Such a motive is easily discovered in his helplessness and his dependence on other people, and it can be designated as fear of loss of love. If he loses the love of another person upon whom he is dependent, he also ceases to be protected from a variety of dangers. Above all, he is exposed to the danger that this stronger person will show his superiority in the form of punishment. At the beginning, therefore, what is bad is whatever causes one to be threatened with loss of love. For fear of that loss, one must avoid it. This, too, is the reason why it makes little difference whether one has already done the bad thing or only intends to do it. In either case, the danger only sets in if and when the authority discovers it, and in either case, the authority would behave in the same way. This state of mind is called a bad conscience, but actually it does not deserve this name. For at this stage, the sense of guilt is clearly only a fear of loss of love, social anxiety. In small children, it can never be anything else, but in many adults too, it has only changed to the extent that the place of the father or the two parents is taken by the larger human community. Consequently, such people habitually allow themselves to do any bad thing which promises them enjoyment, so long as they are sure that the authority will not know anything about it, or cannot blame them for it. They are afraid only of being found out. Today's society has to reckon in general with this state of mind. A great change takes place only when the authority is internalized through the establishment of a superego. The phenomena of conscience then reaches a higher stage. Actually, it is not until now that we should speak of conscience or a sense of guilt. At this point, too, the fear of being found out comes to an end. The distinction, moreover, between doing something bad and wishing to do it disappears entirely, since nothing can be hidden from the superego, not even thoughts. It is true that the seriousness of the situation from a real point of view has passed away, for the new authority, the superego, has no motive that we know of for ill-treating the ego, with which it is intimately bound up. But genetic influence, which leads to the survival of what is past and has been surmounted, makes itself felt in the fact that fundamentally things remain as they were at the beginning. The superego torments the sinful ego with the same feeling of anxiety and is on the watch for opportunities of getting it punished by the external world. At this second stage of development, the conscience exhibits a peculiarity which was absent from the first stage and which is no longer easy to account for. But the more virtuous a man is, the more severe and distrustful is its behavior, so that ultimately it is precisely those people who have carried saintliness furthest who reproach themselves with the worst sinfulness. This means that virtue forfeits some part of its promised reward. The docile and continent ego does not enjoy the trust of its mentor, and strives in vain, it would seem, to acquire it. The objection will at once be made that these difficulties are artificial ones, and it will be said that a stricter, a more vigilant conscience is precisely the hallmark of a moral man. Moreover, when saints call themselves sinners, they are not so wrong, considering the temptations to instinctual satisfaction to which they are exposed is especially in a especially high degree, since, as is well known, temptations are merely increased by constant frustration, whereas an occasional satisfaction of them causes them to diminish, at least for the time being. The field of ethics, which is so full of problems, presents us with another fact, namely that ill luck, that is, external frustration, so greatly enhances the power of the conscience in the superego. As long as things go well with a man, his conscience is lenient and lets the ego do all sorts of things. But when misfortune befalls him, he searches his soul, acknowledges his sinfulness, heightens the demands of his conscience, imposes abstinences on himself, and punishes himself with penances. Whole peoples have behaved in this way and still do. This, however, is easily explained by the original infantile stage of conscience, which, as we see, is not given up after the introjection into the superego, but persists alongside of it and behind it. Fate is regarded as a substitute for the parental agency. If a man is unfortunate, it means that he is no longer loved by this higher power, and threatened by such a loss of love, he once more bows to the parental representative in his superego, a representative whom, in his days of good fortune, he was ready to neglect. This becomes especially clear where fate is looked upon in the strictest religious sense of being nothing else than an expression of divine will. The people of Israel had believed themselves to be the favourite child of God, and when the Great Father caused misfortune after misfortune to rain down upon this people of his, they were never shaken in their belief in his relationship to them or questioned his power of righteousness. Instead, they produced the prophets, who held up their sinfulness before them, and out of their sense of guilt, they created the over-strict commandments of their priestly religion. It is remarkable how differently a primitive man behaves. If he was met with a misfortune, he does not throw the blame on himself, but on his fetish, which has obviously not done its duty, and he gives it a thrashing instead of punishing himself. Thus, we know of two origins of the sense of guilt, one arising from fear of an authority, and the other, later on, arising from fear of the superego. The first insists upon a renunciation of instinctual satisfactions. The second, as well as doing this, presses for punishment, since the continuance of the forbidden wishes cannot be concealed from the superego. We've also learned how the severity of the superego, the demands of conscience, is to be understood. It is simply a continuation of the severity of the external authority, to which it has succeeded and which it has in part replaced. We now see in what relationship the renunciation of instincts stands to the sense of guilt. Originally, renunciation of instinct was the result of fear of an external authority. One renounced one's satisfactions in order not to lose its love. If one has carried out this renunciation, one is, as it were, quits with the authority, and no sense of guilt should remain. But with fear of the superego, the case is different. Here, instinctual renunciation is not enough, for the wish persists and cannot be concealed from the superego. Thus, In spite of the renunciation that has been made, a sense of guilt comes about. This constitutes a great economic disadvantage in the erection of a superego, or, as we may put it, in the formation of conscience. Instinctual renunciation now no longer has a completely liberating effect. Virtuous continence is no longer rewarded with the assurance of love. A threatened external unhappiness, loss of love, and punishment on the part of the external authority has been exchanged for a permanent internal unhappiness, for the tension of the sense of guilt. These interrelations are so complicated and at the same time so important that, at the risk of repeating myself, I shall approach them from yet another angle. The chronological sequence then would be: first comes renunciation of instinct, owing to fear of aggression by the external authority. This is, of course, what fear of the loss of love amounts to, for love is a protection against this punitive aggression. After that comes the erection of an internal authority and renunciation of instinct, owing to fear of it, owing to the fear of conscience. In this second situation, bad intentions are equated with bad actions, and hence comes a sense of guilt and a need for punishment. The aggressiveness of conscience keeps up the aggressiveness of the authority. So far, things have no doubt been made clearer, but where does this leave room for the reinforcing influence of misfortune, of renunciation imposed from without, and for the extraordinary severity of conscience in the best and most tractable people? We've already explained both these peculiarities of conscience, but we probably still have an impression that these explanations do not go to the bottom of the matter and leave a residue still unexplained. And here, at last, an idea comes in which belongs entirely to psychoanalysis and which is foreign to people's ordinary way of thinking. This idea is of a sort which enables us to understand why the subject matter was bound to seem so confused and obscure to us. For it tells us that conscience, or more correctly, the anxiety which later becomes conscience, is indeed the cause of instinctual renunciation to begin with, but that later the relationship is reversed. Every renunciation of instinct now becomes a dynamic source of conscience, and every fresh renunciation increases the latter's severity and intolerance. If we could only bring it better into harmony with what we already know about the history of the origin of conscience, we should be tempted to defend the paradoxical statement that conscience is the result of instinctual renunciation, or that instinctual renunciation imposed on us from without creates conscience, which then demands further instinctual renunciation. The contradiction between this statement and what we have previously said above about the genesis of conscience is in point of fact not so very great, and we see a way of further reducing it. In order to make our exposition easier, let us take as our example the aggressive instinct, and let us assume that the renunciation in question is always a renunciation of aggression. This, of course, is only to be taken as a temporary assumption. The effect of instinctual renunciation on the conscience, then, is that every piece of aggression whose satisfaction the subject gives up is taken over by the superego and increases the latter's aggressiveness against the ego. This does not harmonize well with the view that the original aggressiveness of conscience is a continuance of the severity of the external authority, and therefore has nothing to do with renunciation. But the discrepancy is removed if we postulate a different derivation for this first installment of the superego's aggressivity. A considerable amount of aggressiveness must be developed in the child against the authority, which prevents him from having his first, but nonetheless his most important satisfactions, whatever the kind of instinctual deprivation that is demanded of him may be. But he is obliged to renounce the satisfaction of this revengeful aggressiveness. He finds his way out of this economic difficult situation with the help of familiar mechanisms. By means of identification, he takes the unattackable authority into himself. The authority now turns into his superego and enters into possession of all the aggressiveness which a child would have liked to exercise against it. The child's ego has to content itself with the unhappy role of the authority father, which has been thus degraded. Here, as so often, the real situation is reversed. If I were the father and you were the child, I should treat you badly. The relationship between the superego and the ego is a return, distorted by a wish, of the real relationships between the ego, as yet undivided, and an external object. That is typical too. But the essential difference is that the original severity of the superego does not so much represent the severity which one has experienced from it, the object, or which one attributes to it. It represents rather one's own aggressiveness towards it. If this is correct, we may assert truly that in the beginning, conscience arises through the suppression of an aggressive impulse, and that it is subsequently reinforced by fresh suppressions of the same kind. Which of these two views is correct? The early one, which genetically seems so unassailable, or the newer one, which rounds off the theory in such a welcome fashion? Clearly, and by the evidence too of direct observations, both are justified. They do not contradict each other, and they even coincide at one point. For the child's revengeful aggressiveness will be in part determined by the amount of punitive aggression which he expects from his father. Experience shows, however, that the severity of the superego which a child develops in no way corresponds to the severity of treatment which he has himself met with. The severity of the former seems to be independent of that of the latter. A child who has been very leniently brought up can acquire a very strict conscience. But it would also be wrong to exaggerate this independence. It is not difficult to convince oneself that severity of upbringing does also exert a strong influence on the formation of the child's superego. What it amounts to is that in the formation of the superego and the emergence of a conscience, innate constitutional factors and influences from the real environment act in combination. This is not at all surprising. On the contrary, it is a universal etiological condition for all such processes. And I'm going to read the footnote here. I think it's important. The two main types of pathogenic methods of upbringing, over-strictness and spoiling, have been accurately assessed by Franz Alexander in his book, The Psychoanalysis of the Total Personality, in connection with Acorn's study of delinquency, wayward youth. The unduly lenient and indulgent father is the cause of children's forming an over-severe superego, because under the impression of the love that they receive, they have no other outlet for their aggressiveness but turning it inwards. In delinquent children who have been brought up without love, the tension between ego and superego is lacking, and the whole of their aggressiveness can be directed outwards. Apart from a constitutional factor which may be supposed to be present, it can be said, therefore, that a severe conscience arises from the joint operation of two factors: the frustration of instinct, which unleashes aggressiveness, and the experience of being loved, which turns the aggressiveness inwards and hands it over to the superego. End of footnote. It can also be asserted that when a child reacts to his first great instinctual frustrations with excessively strong aggressiveness and with a correspondingly severe superego, he is following a phylogenetic mode or model and is going beyond the response that would be currently justified. For the father of prehistoric times was undoubtedly terrible, and an extreme amount of aggressiveness may be attributed to him. Thus, if one shifts over from individual to phylogenetic development, the difference between the two theories of the genesis of conscience are still further diminished. On the one hand, a new and important difference makes appearance between these two developmental processes. We cannot get away from the assumption that man's sense of guilt springs from the Oedipus complex and was acquired at the killing of the father by the brothers banded together. On that occasion, an act of aggression was not suppressed but carried out. But it was the same act of aggression whose suppression in the child is supposed to be the source of his sense of guilt. At this point, I should not be surprised if the reader were to exclaim angrily, "So it makes no difference whether one kills one's father or not. One gets a feeling of guilt in either case." We may take leave to raise a few doubts here. Either it is not true that the sense of guilt comes from suppressed aggressiveness, or else the whole story of the killing of the father is a fiction, and the children of primeval man did not kill their fathers any more often than children do nowadays. Besides, if it is not fiction but a plausible piece of history, it would be a case of something happening which everyone expects to happen, namely, of a person feeling guilty because he really has done something which cannot be justified. And of this event, which is after all an everyday occurrence, psychoanalysis has not yet given any explanation. This is true, and we must make good the omission. Nor is there any great secret about the matter. When one has a sense of guilt after having committed a misdeed, and because of it, the feeling should more properly be called remorse. It relates only to a deed that has been done, and of course it presupposes that a conscience, the readiness to feel guilty, was already in existence before the deed took place. Remorse of this sort can, therefore, never help us to discover the origin of conscience and of the sense of guilt in general. What happens in these everyday cases is usually this. An instinctual need acquires the strength to achieve satisfaction in spite of the conscience, which is, after all, limited in its strength, and with the natural weakening of the need owing to its having been satisfied, the former balance of power is restored. Psychoanalysis is thus justified in excluding from the present discussion the case of a sense of guilt due to remorse, however frequently such cases occur and however great their particular importance or their practical importance. But if the human sense of guilt goes back to the killing of the primal father, that was, after all, a case of remorse. Are we assuming that, at that time, a conscience and a sense of guilt were not, as we have presupposed, in existence before the deed? If not, where, in this case, did the remorse come from? There is no doubt that this case should explain the secret of the sense of guilt to us and put an end to our difficulties. and I believe it does. This remorse was the result of the primordial ambivalence of feeling towards the father. His sons hated him, but they loved him too. After their hatred had been satisfied by their act of aggression, their love came to the fore in their remorse for the deed. It set up the superego by identification with the father. And it gave that agency the father's power, as though as a punishment for the deed of aggression they had carried out against him. And it created the restrictions which were intended to prevent a repetition of the deed. And since the inclination to aggressiveness against the father was repeated in the following generations, the sense of guilt too persisted, and it was reinforced once more by every piece of aggressiveness that was suppressed and carried over to the superego. Now, I think, we can at last grasp two things perfectly clearly: the part played by love in the origin of conscience, and the fatal inevitability of the sense of guilt. Whether one has killed one's father or has abstained from doing so is not really the decisive thing. One is bound to feel guilty in either case, for the sense of guilt is an expression of the conflict due to ambivalence, of the eternal struggle between eros and the instinct of destruction or death. This conflict is set going as soon as men are faced with the task of living together. As long as a community assumes no other form than that of the family, the conflict is bound to express itself indeed as complex, to establish the conscience and to create the first sense of guilt. When an attempt is made to widen the community, the same conflict is continued in forms which are dependent on the past, and it is strengthened and results in a further intensification of the sense of guilt. Since civilization obeys an internal erotic impulsion which causes human beings to unite in a close-knit group, it can only achieve this aim through an ever-increasing reinforcement of the sense of guilt. What began in relation to the father is completed in relation to the group. If civilization is a necessary course of development from the family to humanity as a whole, then, as a result of the inborn conflict arising from ambivalence of the external struggle between the trends of love and death, there is inextricably bound up with it an increase of the sense of guilt, which will perhaps reach heights that the individual finds hard to tolerate. One is reminded of the great poet's arraignment of the heavenly powers, and I'm going to read it in English as a footnote. This is one of the harp player's songs in Goethe's Wilhelm Meister. To earth, this weary earth ye bring us, to guilt ye let us heedless go, then leave repentance fierce to wring us, a moment's guilt, an age of woe. And that's Carlyle's translation. And we may well heave a sigh of relief at the thought that it is nevertheless vouchsafed to a few to salvage without effort from the whirlpool of their own feelings the deepest truths, towards which the rest of us have to find our way through tormenting uncertainties and with restless groping. End of chapter.
Thank you very much, Sheila. I'm quite amazed, even though it's our 7th meeting, at how different it is to have the chance to hear the text read out loud and embodied by a singular voice. It really allows for a very different layers of resonance. Thank you very much for that wonderful reading, Sheila. And I'm going to now give the floor to Veronique Voruz. I know there's some people who have joined us more recently who weren't there at the very beginning, so I welcome them. There's 145 participants at the moment, and we're all looking forward to the commentary by Veronique Voruz of this chapter, which is absolutely essential in the journey or the endeavor that we set ourselves to do. Of course, we realize, and this was also something mentioned by Gustavo de Sales, we realize to what extent the reading of Freud's works is nearly impossible for us without Lacan's reading. In a way, and it's an effort to try to step back from that. But at the same time, this chapter is crucial in that it gives us the opportunity to remove the, let's say, mythical aspect of Freud's work, in the sense of what is determined by the times he lived in and he wrote in, and how to extract from it the structural elements that allow us to conceive of subjectivity and civilization in our times, which are certainly quite different. So I will introduce Veronique Voruz, who doesn't really need an introduction. She is a member of the World Association of Psychoanalysis, of the NLS, of the École de la Cause Freudienne. She was an analyst of the school, finished her mandate not that long ago. Is it a year ago too?
October 2018.
Mm-hmm. And she's a crucial contributor to the transmission of Lacanian psychoanalysis in the English language. We have all learned a lot from her transmission as an analyst of the school, from her testimonies, from her renewed...
No one more than me.
Well, from her renewed reading of psychoanalysis and of the analyst as a product of the analytic discourse in our times. So we look forward to listen to you, Veronique, and may I just say that we're going to be taking your questions in the question and answer section so that people can continue to chat and discuss and comment in the chat, and we keep track of the questions for later.
Thank you very much, Florencia, for this introduction. And I have to live up to your expectation. I'll do my best.
Of course.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for your beautiful reading. It's actually a chapter of civilization and its discontents that I wrote about quite a lot a long time ago. So I was happy to reread it from a very different point in my understanding of psychoanalysis. I'm going to proceed in two different ways. So first of all, I'm going to try and situate what's happening in this chapter in relation to what's happened before in the text. So try and stay close to the Freudian construction. And the second thing that I will do is that I will speak about a few things, bits and pieces really, that seems to me pertinent from where we stand now in psychoanalysis as opposed to what was happening in Freud's time. But first of all, I want to stay close to the text. And to do that, I want to start by recalling what Freud was speaking of in the previous chapter that we read 2 weeks ago, that Tom Ryan gave a reading of 2 weeks ago. If you remember, in chapter 6 of Civilization and Its Discontents, we see that the myth of two conflicting forces, the life and death instinct, is at the heart of the Freudian theory of civilization. In fact, we know that in Freud, there is always a conflict to explain whatever discontent symptom there is. There has to be a conflict. So the conflict is central to the Freudian construction. And here we find, when it comes to explaining civilization, we find another conflict. It's the conflict between life and death. And we can think of pleasure and reality, for example, as the conflict which is at play in the formation of symptoms. So in chapter 6, we see Freud exposing the conflict between life and death. In that chapter, if you recall, sorry, Freud also postulated that the instinct for destruction was associated with the need for mastery, omnipotence, or the means by which the ego ensures its vital needs are met at the expense of everyone and everything else. So a very central place given to aggressiveness. In fact, if you recall, on page 122 of the Standard Edition, Freud concludes that the inclination to aggression is an original, self-substituting instinctual disposition in man, and that it constitutes the greatest impediment to civilization. By contrast to ugliness, Eros, Freud says, is in the service of civilization to combine single human individuals and after that families, then races, peoples and nations into one great unity, the unity of mankind. These collections of men are to be libidinally bound to one another. So I ask you to pay attention to this formulation, are to be libidinally bound to one another. I'll say a few things later about this formulation. In any case, we see Freud seeking to extrapolate psychoanalysis beyond the explanation or the understanding of the individual psyche to understanding the whole of the functioning of humanity. It's a very ambitious project, and you may remember that in lay analysis, what is it in English? Freud says psychoanalysis is more important to understanding humanity than it is as a clinical practice. That's one may agree or not agree with this, but it's Freud's idea. And here we see him attempting to explain human inventions, human constructs, human structures. So Freud in chapter 6 hypothesized these two primal and opposing instinctual forces. Once he's done that, he then formulates his theory of the evolution of mankind in the following terms. I'm reading them out to you. And now, he says on page 122, the meaning of the evolution of civilization is no longer obscure to us. It must present the struggle between eros and death, between the instinct of life and the instinct of destruction, as it works itself out in the human species. This struggle is what all life consists of, and the evolution of civilization may therefore simply be described as the struggle for life of the human species. So we can see from this lucid, quasi-functionalist formulation that Freud is far from buying into a narrative of progress to account for the development of civilization. I will say more about this later. In any case, what remains for our current purposes of getting to grips with the text is that Freud has now situated aggressiveness as the greatest impediment to civilization. And this leaves him faced with the problem that he will now tackle in the chapter that Sheila just read for us. Indeed, this is Freud's formulation to introduce the question. I read from page 123 in the Standard Edition. What means does civilization employ in order to inhibit the aggressiveness which opposes it, to make it harmless, to get rid of it, perhaps? So it's the question that we are starting with. If civilization is impeded by aggressiveness, then it also needs to inhibit it. And as we have just read from chapter 7, it is dedicated, this chapter, to the superego. It's the third agency in Freud's second topic of ego, id, and superego, in which the superego is a mediating agency between the other two. But here in this text, we find the concept articulated not with the other agencies of the psychical apparatus, as we have in the ego and the id, for instance, but with Freud's current concern with the question of civilization. So here, what is the superego? It is the psychical agency tasked with the inhibition of aggressiveness. This function, first set up in individuals, is therefore recuperated by civilization. I'm going to read this sentence, which I find quite striking, from the bottom of page 123 and the top of page 124. For it says, civilization, therefore, obtains mastery over the individual's dangerous desire for aggression by weakening and disarming it, and by setting up an agency within him to watch over it like a garrison in a conquered city. A very striking formulation. The superego is like a garrison in a conquered city. How does the superego discharge this task, according to Freud? How does the superego manage to inhibit aggressiveness? I'm going to take a small step back here to get a better picture of what Freud is concerned with in this text. I would say that we can apportion his concern according to two lines of inquiry. First, by what means does civilization hold together at all? And second, what discontents are generated in the process? I think that they are the two crucial questions of the text. We have just heard that the superego is central to both of these questions. At the same time, it makes civilization hold together and it generates a great deal of discontent in the process. I'll try to develop these questions a little to provide elements to further our collective reflection. I hope we can discuss this later in the conversation. So the first line of inquiry is, by what means does civilization hold together at all? Here we need to bear in mind that for Freud, this question concerns first and foremost libidinal economy, or the circulation of libido in human groups. That's why I asked you to pay attention to the formulation, these collections of men are to be libidinally bound to one another. Okay, so the tie is libidinal. We can see that this approach was already at play in Freud's 1921 group psychology and the analysis of the ego. If you don't have this text in mind, let me remind you that in the text, Freud ponders over the existence of libidinal ties between members of a group that are not connected to one another by sexual interest. You recall that it is in that text that he introduces the notion of identification as a way to account for the libidinal constitution of the human group. He concludes that the human group holds together by means of a shared identification to a leader. That's the response in 1921. Now we have the question brought to the power of civilization. So we understand more or less what makes a group hold together, but what is it that makes humanity as a whole hold together? So let us formulate the question of libidinal economy as it is constructed in this text. Let's first remind ourselves that for Freud, nothing exists in psychical reality that isn't libidinally affected. I'm taking the translation by Strachey here. For investment, cathexis. The vectors of cathexis that Freud first develops are ego and sexual libido. The instinct of self-preservation treats the ego as a precious object, and the sexual instinct conducts ego libido outwards so that it may invest an object of sexual satisfaction. This hypothesis rests on Freud's idea of the reversibility of ego libido. It can travel back and forth between ego and object. The quantum of libido being constant, it needs to be distributed and invested according to an individual's priorities. So that's the first theory of the drives at the individual level. The introduction of eros and thanatos is necessary to extrapolate the Freudian account of subjectivity to the functioning of the human species as a whole. What thanatos destroys, eros binds. But how does it work in the psychical apparatus, in practice, for each individual? How can it be extrapolated from the individual level to the level of humanity? This is what chapter 7 begins to address, with Freud once again relying on the Oedipus complex as the matrix that institutes the human psyche as we know it. We will see how Freud formulates its functioning as we develop the second question: what discontents are produced in the process. For Freud, das Unbehagen, so unease, malaise, discontent, is the effect of the non-satisfaction of instinctual impulses. Civilization is founded upon the renunciation to certain satisfactions. Here we see Freud then trying to extrapolate the Oedipus complex to civilization as a whole, as we find expressed at the end of chapter 7. I'm going to read from page 132-33 in the standard edition. This conflict between eros and the instinct of destruction or death is set going as soon as men are faced with the task of living together. So long as the community assumes no other form than that of the family, the conflict is bound to express itself in the Oedipus complex. When an attempt is made to widen the community, the same conflict is continued in forms which are dependent on the past. Let us recall here, for ease of understanding, the mechanism of the Oedipus complex. We remember that for Freud, the infant must renounce his sexual love for the parents of the opposite sex. This is enforced by means of the incest prohibition, which in turn gives rise to aggressiveness against the prohibiting agency. How does the child deal with this aggressiveness? He cannot give way to it, as he is dependent upon the parental authority for his survival due to his impotence and helplessness. He therefore internalizes his aggressiveness and directs it upon himself. The agency of the superego, once instated, is the introjected parental figure which punishes the child for either carrying out the forbidden act or obtaining substitutive satisfaction for the same impulse. Nothing can be hidden from the superego, not even thought, as we've just heard being reminded to us. Here we note that Freud's idea of the plasticity of libido is essential, and we see it functioning in his theory of the superego. Dammed up instinctual satisfaction finds an outlet in the superego's attack on the ego. There is, as we know, for Freud, and indifference to the object of satisfaction, provided the aim of discharge is achieved. This is, of course, in Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, 1915 text. The individual superego is therefore the agency which prevents non-conforming impulses from enacting themselves, and the ensuing aggressiveness from being released outwards. But because it is only the representative of the drive that can be repressed, and not the drive needs to find satisfaction. Due either to the external or internal threat of loss of love, and therefore of loss of protection, the superego has no other choice than to release aggressiveness against the ego, which it takes as its object. Here, I like to think of the concluding line of The Economic Problem of Masochism, Freud's fantastic 1924 text, to which Lacan's Kant with sad is a response. Freud concludes the text by saying, even the subject's destruction of himself cannot take place without libidinal satisfaction. A chilling conclusion. How is this extrapolated to the level of civilization as a whole? I'm not going to say too much about it because it is the topic broached in chapter 8, where Freud postulates the existence of a cultural superego, which contains demands and ideals derived from a culture and addressed in return to the members of that cultural group. Freud, so I'm going to leave Tom to develop that idea. Freud also proposes that the more advanced the civilization, the stronger the sense of guilt, because as a civilization develops, its ethical demands are ever higher, and therefore the satisfactions we need to renounce are ever more precious to us. Guilt, indeed, for Freud, is the product of impulses being inhibited in their aims. Though I will leave it to Tom to comment on Freud's conclusions, we can perhaps simply observe here that the sense of guilt that Freud presented as the undesirable yet unavoidable byproduct of civilization no longer seems dominant in the clinical landscape of our times, where it is anxiety that has come to the fore. So once more, the question remains for us of what is relevant today in Freud's construction. That's a question I addressed a little bit in my first presentation. So this is a brief and summary rendering of what Freud attempts to do in chapter 7. Now I'm going to say a few of the comments that I was inspired with upon rereading this chapter and this text as a whole. Can I continue? Or? I want to start my more personal commentary from the concept of virology that Neus Carbonell extracted from the session of the 8th of April of Seminar 22. If you remember, 2 weeks ago, Neus introduced this Lacanian neologism to underline, it seems to me, to underline that there is no hope for biological homeostasis for the human organism. I find it extremely important, this invention of Lacan's, because it allows us to not essentialize the death drive. I find it extremely problematic that we tend to think that the death drive has an essence, that it's an avoidable component of human civilization as such. And it seems to me that Lacan's introduction of this neologism that Neus picked up on takes us away from any such temptation to consider that the death drive has an essence. It is Freud's mythology. Lacan's neologism of biology allows us to have a much more functional understanding of what is truly at stake for a speaking being. I would say it in simple terms. Human beings simply cannot hope to regulate their bodies according to the laws of nature. We are denatured, and one manifestation of this denaturation is what Freud named and essentialized as the death drive. It is a fact, and we know it in our practice, that human bodies are traversed and sometimes devastated by the drive, that the human body is not fully regulated by what an organism knows of how to survive. This is a distinction that Jacques Miller makes in Lacanian biology. There is the knowledge that the body has for what it needs in order to survive. We need to breathe, we need to eat, we need to sleep, and so on. And our organs know what they have to do, and so on. And there is something which cannot be regulated by biology. So I really appreciated Neus bringing up this passing neologism, because it is important to help us to explore the idea of hope. To have no hope does not mean to despair. To have no hope is to give up on the illusion of progress, on the idea that things will sort themselves out for the best, that the invisible hand of the market will produce an equilibrium between human needs and corporate profit, that science will return the planet to us as new. No, we won't be able to live forever in endlessly rejuvenated bodies, and no, capitalism will not yield a satisfaction that could put an end to the endless pursuit for the lost object. It will instead reabsorb every disruption of the automaton of our lives for profit, as we see already with the proliferating ads for designer masks and so on. To give up on hope opens the way to acquiring a know-how with one's real, rather than wishing or waiting for the world to be different. If what we suffer from at the time of capitalism, according to Lacan, is the entropy of a jouissance that doesn't count, what psychoanalysis offers is a way to make loss count as a way out of this entropy. Another way of understanding virology has to do with what is a body for us. Once the organism is marked by language, it becomes a body that the subject must acquire a relation to. We can hear it so clearly in our practice, where people constantly speak of their bodies as a foreign object that they must relate to. I hate my body. I don't recognize my body. I have a strange relationship with my body. I don't identify with my body, etc. This allows us to understand why Lacan says one is not a body, one has a body. Language, what biology tells us, is that language effects a disruption of jouissance on the life of the organism. This is why Jacques-Alain Miller placing jouissance as the primary body event is so important. Jouissance as the primary body event, which needs to be at the center of contemporary psychoanalytic theory. In our practice, we aim at the treatment of this senseless jouissance that iterates. This is the only way to extract the speaking being from the infernal logic of capitalism, which aspires us in the spiral of a consumerism which consumes us. It consumes our time, it consumes our money, it consumes everything. We have been able to witness it on the occasion of this pandemic with the relief that most of us have experienced and heard our patients speak of, from no longer being subjected to the frenzy of lifestyle consumerism and constantly running around trying to achieve some goal of perfect life. So that's the first comment which I wanted to make. I also wanted to make a second comment that this time relates to the death drive and the Lacanian superego. We first note that Lacan is extremely attentive when it comes to Freud's binarism of the drives. And as early as in Seminar 2, he will highlight the unitary nature of the drives. No notion is more unitary, he will say. We also find this taken up by Jacques-Alain Miller in Lacanian biology when he uses the expression the monism of the drive. That can also make us think of Éric Laurent's recent answer to Paul B. Preciado when he spoke of the unarism of the sexes. There is no binary in Lacanian theory. It seems to me that sidestepping binarism is extremely important. Why? Binarism is the operating principle of the symbolic order. Since Aristotle, the world has been systematically ordered by means of classifications and categories. As Lacan puts it in Seminar 9, hedgehogs and non-hedgehogs, as an example. Everything that is not a hedgehog is a non-hedgehog. But the symbolic order is losing its privilege. It is no longer able to order the world by means of signifying pairs, man, woman, black, white, foreigner, non-foreigner. So we need to think of new ways of ordering the world. We can see, in fact, that what we see coming to the fore is the idea of a series or of a spectrum ordering human beings in connection to their modes of jouissance. And as early as Seminar 9, in the last chapters, Lacan took stock of the end of the privilege of the symbolic. And he said that in order to continue understanding human logic, we had to construct a logic of the structuration of the object of desire in order to supplement or replace the signifying logic which we had relied on thus far in order to try and understand ourselves. It's in this vein, the idea of the structuration of a logic of the object of desire, that I see Lacan's construction of the superego. We know that there are no drives that are not partial drives. In other words, the drive is organized by an object which is detachable from the body. Then we have to ask ourselves which object is at play in the superegoic drive. And we know that Lacan, in Kant with Sade, says that it is the voice, that behind the Kantian imperative, there is the voice of the superego that orders to give up on all satisfaction. So the superego takes its place in the structuration of the logic of the object of desire. It allows us to come up with a different understanding of the superego than the Freudian one. In his text, Jacques Lacan on the Voice, which we translated for the notebooks many years ago, and which was compiled in the volume The Later Lacan, Jacques-Alain Miller says this about the voice. The voice is the part of the signifying chain which is not assumable by the subject as an I, and which is subjectively assigned to the other. Okay, so this is a very, very interesting definition of the superego, it seems to me. It's that part of the signifying chain which is not assumable by the subject as an I. In other words, it's that which cannot be subjectivized of jouissance. And therefore it's ascribed to the other. The other wants me to work every day, the other wants me to be perfect, etc. But in fact, it's part of the structuration of our own desire. And I find this extremely important in dealing with the superego, because we know from our practice that we incessantly hear subjects complaining of an extremely ferocious superego, demanding ever more from them. So that's my second comment. I have then a third comment to make, which has to do with a reflection that came to me when I was rereading this text. Is the death drive atemporal, or is it historically contingent?
Can you repeat that, Veronique?
Is the death drive atemporal, or is it historically contingent? Have we always have the death drive in civilization? Of course, it's very difficult to speculate because, as we know, we can only think from the perspective at which we are today. But it seems to me that it's possible perhaps to have some ideas on how to answer this question. We know that in Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud explores the idea that yes, there is an instinct for destruction in human beings. I think nobody will deny that there is aggressiveness and that there has always been aggressiveness. But Freud develops the idea that the death drive has to do with a form of civilization. And it is the form that it takes is specific to the civilization in which it arises. In Freud's time, it had to do with a civilization that demands too much instinctual repression. So what else do we bring to this reflection? My question of whether the death drive has any kind of essence. Today I'm going to read a little bit from the last lesson of Seminar 21, The Non-Duke's Heir. I don't have an English translation, and I'm going to try and translate as I read. So it relies on the distinction between connaissance and savoir, which cannot be translated in English, and it's extremely unfortunate because it's a distinction that Lacan often uses and to different effects. So Lacan says in this seminar, who is not in love with his unconscious heirs. Okay, and then he says, this says nothing at all against the past centuries. They were just as much as everybody else in love with their unconscious, and therefore they did not err. Simply, they did not know where they were going. But to be in love with the unconscious, that they surely were. They believed it was connaissance, because there is no need to know oneself to be in love with one's unconscious, to not err. All that we have to do is to allow oneself to be its dupe. But for the first time in history, it is possible for you to err, that is, to refuse to love your unconscious, because you finally know what it is. It's a knowledge, and it's a really annoying one. Okay, so here we have, I think, a very important indication, because it's at the moment at which we begin to divide ourselves from our unconscious, in other words, to not simply believe it to be our nature, and we begin to assume that it means something, but there is a knowledge in us we don't know that we have, that we begin to err. First of all, by refusing to decipher it, we err, and we know that because we live in a world in which the semblant of psychoanalysis has overtaken psychoanalysis. Everybody has keys with which they can translate what they're experiencing without undergoing a process of analysis. So there is a knowledge that is separate from simply being, if you want, naturally living one's life as if there was no division. So we have this idea that there is a knowledge about ourselves, and that if we don't take it seriously, we will err. That's Lacan's proposition. And for me, I had the idea that perhaps it was possible to situate the emergence of a death drive at a particular moment in time, which we could situate perhaps at the moment of the scientific renaissance, beginning with Descartes and the birth of the human sciences. It's what Foucault calls the emergence of the empirico-transcendental duet. In other words, the man divides himself from himself to take himself as an object of knowledge. Okay, so for the first time in history, instead of relating to the world as if it was ordered by nature, we try and produce a science about ourselves. So we are divided from ourselves by the discourse of science, and we take ourselves as an object of our knowledge. So this is the beginning of the end of connaissance. We no longer have an intuitive knowledge of how we function, but we try to know something about it. And it seems to me that the more we know about ourselves, and the more we exacerbate something of the death drive. I'm calling it the death drive here, but I would be happier to call it the will to knowledge. It's a concept that comes from Nietzsche and which is explored by Michel Foucault in his amazing book, The Birth of the Clinic, the archaeology of the medical gaze, in which he shows that in order to know everything that there is about the human, we need that human to be a corpse. In other words, we need to be able to open the body and to find out what went wrong. So I think it's for me it's quite a pertinent understanding of how science produces this sadistic impulse, this epistemological drive, which has a sadistic component to it. And it seems to me that Lacan makes a very important comment in Seminar 16, D'un autre à l'autre, from the big other to the other, where he says, contrary to what people may think, the more we know, the more impotent we are. It's a reversal of the position of Michel Foucault that we all know, that power is knowledge. Knowledge is power, and so on. For Lacan, it's the opposite. In fact, the more we know, the more impotent we are in regulating the jouissance of the body. It seems to me that it is the exacerbation of this impotence and the augmentation of knowledge, which is leaving us completely bereft when it comes to knowing what we need to do in order to manage to have a regulated body and to not be devastated by the drive. So that's my third comment. I also want to point out that we had connaissance, we have knowledge, and now we have information. And so I would like to say connaissance, for me, the clearest way of understanding what Lacan says of connaissance is in Seminar 24, when he says, un homme connaît une femme quand il fait l'amour avec elle. A man knows a woman when he makes love to her. It's not knowledge. You don't have the knowledge of how to make love to a woman. You have to have a connaissance of what it is to make love to this particular woman. And Lacan takes this example to say it's the same with your symptom. You cannot have knowledge of your symptom. You can have connaissance of your symptom. So it's an important reversal in Lacan's work after Seminar 23, where he says, finally, in the end, all we can hope to achieve is to have this connaissance of our symptom and to not seek to reduce our symptom to a knowledge, because this doesn't work. This being said, knowledge had this going for itself, which is that it included the desire of the other. So the acquisition of knowledge, in order to acquire knowledge, we had to go through the desire of the other that transmitted this knowledge to us. So it was the acquisition of knowledge was implicated in the structuration of our desire. But now we have shifted to information. When you need information, you go on to Google and you ask the question to Google, and Google gives it to you, whether you look good, whether you're nice, whether you pay or you don't pay. In other words, you don't have to put anything of your jouissance at play in order to obtain it, which means it has absolutely no effect in terms of the structuration of your desire. So that's yet another stage in the evolution of our civilization. And so it seems to me that's why we might have the impression that the impulse for destructiveness is exacerbated today, because we are pushed to a kind of instinctual impasse where we don't know how to get out of it except by destroying everything that has ever been. It's what Lacan says in The Triumph of Religion, that men, having produced all these objects that plague them and can only become waste, and we will be so encumbered by the waste that we produce that we will have no choice but to destroy ourselves to escape from it. So that's a little bit of my attempt to try and render the death drive something which is not to be essentialized, but which takes on specific forms according to the kind of civilization that we live in. I've also put up on a couple of questions from the chat during Sheila's reading. So perhaps I can begin by answering this question.
I think it's we have two questions in the question and answers, and also there were some in the chat. It would be great, Veronique, if you want to address those. I think your commentary has really opened up in a very logical way what I was suggesting about how to extract from Freud's work that which constitutes the structure, or I think I would rather say the logical problems rather than the structural problems. Yeah. And especially the reference that you make to the idea of regulation and some other aspects of your commentary that resonate with the myriad of new therapies offered, especially in the last 10 years, based on the treatment of shame, based on hope, based on forgiveness. You can see clearly how there is a pre-Freudian attempt which doesn't call itself religious, of course, it calls itself scientific, but that's what we see. So it's very, very valuable to situate the problems. The point of real that the various discourses attempt to circumscribe. And in a way, Veronique, I think how you defined what an analytic experience is and what it aims for, when you said it's about finding a way to make loss count, is absolutely crucial, because it's what the contemporary state of civilization makes very difficult. And we see this especially in the analyses that have gone far enough, but that where the analysand struggles to find, let's say, the exit point or the right door, when the analysis is beyond the point of the fundamental fantasy and beyond the point of, let's say, the deciphering of the transferential unconscious, we find that what remains the bone that continues to prevent this access to a knowing how is how to make loss count. This is the last reduct, if I say so. Go ahead with the questions, Veronique.
I just wanted to perhaps answer to the question about self-help, because it goes towards what you were saying, but for me that's exactly the point of when Lacan says those that do not love their unconscious err. Precisely, if you function based on the denial of the unconscious or denegation of the unconscious, then you are left with these solutions which aim at strengthening the ego, making positive reinforcement. I am strong, I am lovable, I deserve to be loved. I mean, so many times in our analysis, we see our patients coming saying, I deserve better. You know, why do you deserve better? Yeah, it's crazy. It's a way of boosting your ego in order to shore up the defenses of the ego against what is unleashed underneath. So for me, it's a completely self-defeating enterprise, and indeed violent. I think Sarah Meehan was saying in the comments that it's a violent enterprise, and it's an endless enterprise because it needs to be done over and over again. So the solution of psychoanalysis, if you want, is to go with the solution that the unconscious already is. Like, and it also goes to Sarah Meehan's other question about ascribing meaning to fate. For me, it really evokes what Eric Laurent says in his text, Disruption of Jouissance in the Psychosis Under Transference.
Sorry, Veronique, can you repeat the question?
You know, what Sarah Meehan says, it's very interesting, ascribing meaning to fate, or to fortune.
To bad luck, yeah.
To bad luck. So there is this phrase in Eric Laurent's text, the disruption of jouissance in the psychosis, in the madnesses under transference, where he says, what is the unconscious? It's a treatment of the disruption of jouissance by means of the elaboration of a non-standard fiction. Okay, so in other words, the transferential unconscious is already that. We are all the seat of a disruption of jouissance, which is senseless, and we seek to treat it by means of the elaboration of a non-standard fiction. So we all have our fiction, except that you know, the elaboration of a non-standard fiction, if it's not oriented by one's unconscious in analysis, simply amounts to telling oneself the story. It's what narrative psychiatry is proposing as a new solution. Let's allow the subject to create a narrative of themselves that will allow them to reincorporate everything and to make a story. But that does not work when it comes to treating the drive. And the non-standard fiction, so it's treating jouissance by means of the concatenation of the signifying chain. Turning the experience of your body into sense. Okay. It goes some way.
There is also a question by Angel Angelov, our colleague from Bulgaria. Could you comment on the difference between the drive and jouissance, for example, in the case of guilt? I think it goes well with what you were saying.
Right. A very difficult question. Because jouissance has so many different meanings. But first of all, when we start to deal with jouissance in our field, we approach it by means of the partial drive. Okay, so we try to think of all the ways in which the body enjoys itself, we could say. And it enjoys itself by means of demand, need, desire, ideal, and superego. That's the formalization that Lacan gives in Seminar 10. In other words, by the circuit that an object which is detachable from the body allows you to create with another. Okay, the other has what I want, the other wants me to look in a certain way, etc. So you have all of this construction of the drive, and it's Lacan's attempt at producing a scientific logic of the structuration of the object of desire. As I was saying at the end of Seminar 9, he gives himself this project to supplement signifying logic with the logic of the structuration of the object of desire, so to include the drive object in the structuration of one's desire. But later on, the drive becomes something different because we have this new definition. It's the echo in the body of the fact that there is speech, simply. So it's simply the fact that the body resonates, not as organism, but as body marked with speech. And in a way, it becomes the new problem for psychoanalysis. It's how to treat that which iterates, that which echoes in the body of the fact that there was a saying, of the fact that there was that we were caught up in language before we could make sense of what happened to us.
but also in relation to how you situated the question of Eros and the death drive at the beginning. It is absolutely the case. We verify this in our clinic every day, that sexuality as a means for treating that mark is no longer the same. We could say. If we take, for example, the idea of fields of jouissance in Lacan's later teaching from the third onwards, and because what you speak about, Veronique, in terms of regulating of the body at the end of the day is why Lacan came out of this binarism, which is still present in Seminar 20, because when we have the formula of sexuation, we still have a binarism, even if we make the effort not to read it in terms of biological sex. When we say feminine and masculine, that's a binarism. However, from the third and in the later teaching, it's no longer this question of jouissance in terms of sexuation, but what you were saying about the symptom in terms of with the fields of jouissance as established in the three registers, what constitutes a limit for each type of jouissance in the interconnection of the registers. It's completely different. It's what comes to constitute a limit, and that's how Lacan comes out of the binarism. So I won't take more time with that because there are other questions. I'm taking Eugénie Ostan, and then Reclose. The passage, Eugénie asks, the passage at the end of the chapter that Veronique quoted includes, so long as the community assumes no other form than the family. Do Freud or Lacan ever ponder significant social bonds or community structures of other sorts? And might the resulting civilization be any less discontent?
Hope. I think when it comes to Freud, the answer is no. For Freud, it's not possible to conceive of a social bond which is not structured according to the family. I mean, we didn't really comment on this, but in chapter 7, the reference is to totem and taboo, and the primal father, the primal murder, and so on. For Freud, what is not demonstrable by means of the Oedipus complex is demonstrable phylogenetically by means of the transmission of the primal guilt ascribed to the murder of the father, and so on. So for Freud, the family structure replicates throughout civilization. For Lacan, I think the four discourses are a way to establish that there are different forms of social bonds. And in Seminar 17, when he says, so Seminar 16 is opened with the phrase discourse without speech, un discours sans parole, le discourse without words. So it's Lacan's attempt to exit sense and to show that the social bond is structured by different functions and according to the place of these functions. So we have, the possibility of having the object A, the divided subject, S1 and S2 in a function of what articulates a particular social bond. So Lacan is definitely steering well clear of the family. And he's trying to show that there are many other means of making social bond, but I don't think he would be naive enough to say that any of these is better. And the analytical discourse, as we know, is a discourse that applies to another discourse. It's not a discourse that can substitute for other discourses.
Exactly.
This is why in our communities we are endlessly struggling to make a community function in a way that respects the analytical bond, the analytical discourse. If you remember in the Turing theory of the school, Miller says in an analytical community, even the doors have to be part of the analytical discourse. Everything has to answer to the logic of the analytical discourse, because if it doesn't, then we fall back into one of the other discourses, and then we go back into the discourse of impotence or discourse of identification and so on. So we constantly have to go against the grain. Psychoanalysis against the grain of the unconscious.
Rick Lose has two questions. Is science a kind of death drive? And can you say a little bit more about the entropy of jouissance? I also remind our panelists, Sheila, Raphael, Neus, Cecilia, that they're invited to make comments or questions as well.
Is science a kind of death drive? It's very difficult when we speak of science, because there's nothing to say against science itself. If you remember, when I first commented on this text, it was on chapter 3 or 4, I can't remember. I was referring to what Shanahan Miller says of the universalization of the subject by science. And you were saying it's wonderful because everybody can be a subject of science. In other words, whether you are a man or a woman or a homosexual person or somebody from Somalia, it doesn't matter, because you are equal before science. You can have the same access to science. So there is a universalization of the subject by science, which is extremely desegregating, because it puts us all in the same position. And then what Miller says is the problem is that science contains no knowledge as to jouissance. And therefore, science is impotent when it comes to regulating jouissance. All it can do is provide scientific solutions to scientific problems. So the problem is when science becomes erected to the level of the master's discourse, which is Lacan's thesis in Seminar 17. It forecloses the question of truth. In other words, what of language can treat jouissance in the body? And that's extremely problematic, because it gives the subject weaponless in front of the jouissance that devastates him. And if you address yourself to science, I don't like my body, well, why don't you have liposuction? Why don't you have facial reconstruction? Why don't you have gender reassignment? And why don't you buy a child from a surrogate mother in India, and so on? So science, in its alliance with capitalism, provides you with the object that you think you want in order to make up for what you have lost through the entropy of jouissance.
Mm-hmm.
And jouissance means that you are suffering from a deperdition of jouissance, which is not countable. And that's really a thesis of Marx, which Lacan picks up in its connection with Freud and Freud's invention of the lost object, to say that there is a deperdition of jouissance by virtue of one's entry into language, and that if you don't allow this deperdition of jouissance to count as loss, then the only avenue which is offered to you by the combination of science and capitalism is the quest for the surplus jouissance. Mm-hmm. Except that quest is what consumes us. It offers no breaks to the jouissance that devastates us. So in that sense, yes, science has a connection with the death drive.
It's for me the clearest formulation of a very, very complex notion that I've ever heard. So I thank you very much, Veronique, for that. I think it will be really useful as well for those of us who are taking part in the London Society Seminar of Reading 17. Fantastic. I'm going to take one moment to see if any of our participants, attendees, panelists would like to comment on something, ask a question?
Yeah, Florencia, I might like to just say something with respect to perhaps reading Freud, the very early Freud, in conjunction with the very last Lacan. So some probably 34 or 35 years before he writes Civilization, he becomes interested in what? He becomes interested in what is a symptom in relation to the body and in relation to libido, to sexuality. In 1893, he establishes something. I'll quote him. In other cases, the connection is not so simple. It consists only in what might be called a symbolic relation between the precipitating cause and the pathological phenomenon. A relation such as healthy people form in dreams. So I could say a few things about this. This is, for me, this is the basis of the genesis of psychoanalysis. Freud has a distinction at this point in time between neurotic and healthy people. And this is a distinction that, of course, through the course of his work, doesn't hold up. I think it's just interesting to make that point, and this is all I'm going to say about it in relation to Veronique's excellent commentary, particularly in relation to disruptions of jouissance and one's concept of what is one's body and what is symptomatic. That has a symbolic or transferential component in relation to the desire of the other, but also has this relation to, as we were saying earlier on, an abruptness of the real. So I wonder if anyone else would like to say something along those lines. I think that's very interesting to read the very first Freud in this context. Thank you.
What I find really nice in Lacan, at the end of Seminar 11, he says, psychoanalysts will not teach you how to make love better. It's really nice because sexuality is not having sex. I don't know if that helps, but
well, I think this is what Freud stumbles upon in the late 1800s. He just doesn't have, he takes the rest of his career to try to formulate that.
Lacan substitutes, the non-sexual relation. In other words, the fact that there is a hole in knowledge when it comes to regulating the jouissance of speaking bodies.
Mm-hmm.
That's all that we all have to make do with that. And in a way, I don't know if I listened to Fabienne Fanwak's commentary at the lecture at the ECF 2 weeks ago about love in the later Lacan, and it was about how to use love to knot the three rings. And I found this very, very interesting because it's not love as a supplement to the sexual relation that there isn't, which is the thesis in Seminar 20. In other words, by loving someone, you seek to make the sexual relation exist. But it's about using love as a way to live with the fact that the sexual relation doesn't exist and still make a bond with another person based on that assumption. So it's also this idea of how to make loss count.
Yeah, and perhaps this is not far from what we're doing here this morning. I thank you very much, Sheila, Veronique, Raphael, Neus, Cecilia, Thomas, Rick, Joanne, everyone. I can't name everyone. We were quite a few today. I'm delighted about that. apologize if there were comments or questions missed, but I think we can say that we are heading to a wonderful last final meeting in 2 weeks' time with Thomas Svolos on the 30th. Another announcement that I would like to make is that effectively this seminar, Oceanic, is going to be published in a video form in its integrity after we conclude on the 30th of May. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks very much for being here, and we continue. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Florencia. Thank you all.
Bye.